Most everyone is happy to see spring arrive this year after the frigid winter we just had. The mountains had another banner year, not just the big resorts, but even smaller hills like Beartown in West Shazy. Long before the resorts of today, just about every town in the Adirondacks had a small, community-owned or family-run ski area, and only a handful remain today. And as more vanish into the landscape, a historian and author has spent several years researching and documenting these pieces of Adirondack history before they fade forever into the past. And Jeremy Davis is with us. He is our guest this week. Welcome.
Thank you, Tom.
Now, you are a meteorologist by trade.
Yes.
Your company in Glens Falls provides customized weather data and forecasts for marine clients around the world, from giant freighters on the oceans to celebrities and their yachts. So
Yes.
How did you get interested in this topic and begin this?
Yeah, so I was always interested. I learned to ski in 1989. I'm from Massachusetts originally, and I learned to ski in 1989. And one of our first family trips was up to New Hampshire. And it was just when I was starting to learn about skiing in different ski areas. I was 12, 13 years old. And on the way up there, we passed by a ski area called Mount Whittier. And it had been abandoned about 6 or 7 years, and it had a gondola that went over the road. Very fascinating. And as a kid, exploring abandoned places and kind of being curious what they were like was kind of a pastime. And looked at this big mountain, and then here's all these lifts rusting away. There's the base lodge that's not looking too good. What happened? That was my question. And this is well before the internet. You couldn't Google it or anything like that. So I just said, someday I'm going to find out what happened here. And I tried to scrounge up a little bit of information here or there. And then I started finding out there were other places. We'd take family trips and stop somewhere and be like, wait a minute, that looks like a lost ski area there on the side of the road, and drag my parents and my family, which were always great to go and check these areas out. And I just went to some antique stores, got old books, postcards, and started to collect it. Then when I went to college up at Linden State in the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont, more technology started to become available up there. There was, you'd be able to use a scanner for the first time and stuff like that. And the internet was starting to get going, and I put up a little website called NELSAP, which was the New England Lost Ski Areas Project, and started to share the information that I knew, and with hopes that other people would be able to share as well. Mm-hmm. So like crowdsourcing, well before that became a term. So before you know it, the site just took off. And that eventually then led to writing 4 books as well.
And you still maintain the site today.
Absolutely.
In fact, that's where probably you get a lot of photos and
Sure.
Little ski areas for you to check out from people all over the Northeast and New York.
Exactly. The site would not be where it is today without everybody that's contributed to it. It's a free site. People send in their information, and it's been invaluable because a lot of people have very specific memories, photos, memorabilia from places that are obscure. And without those contributions, we would definitely not have the site where we are today. It's
and
invaluable.
You got so much material, as you mentioned. You've written 4 books. You started in New Hampshire.
Yes.
Then you did Vermont. Then you did Southern Adirondacks, which came up as far as Lake George, Ticonderoga.
Sure. Yep. Ticonderoga. Yep.
And up there. And now your 4th book, Lost Ski Areas of the Northern Adirondacks. And you look at dozens of ski areas that really are no more. There are a few that you mentioned. There are exceptions that have survived, like Big Tupper and Otis Mountain in Elizabethtown. But there are so many others that we grew up with, the community slopes, that have sort of faded.
Yeah, 47 areas have closed in the Northern Adirondacks and 38 in the Southern Adirondacks. So 85 total in the whole Adirondack region, which is an astounding number when you think about it. And for the Adirondack region, I mean, it expands a little bit beyond the Adirondacks up to the St. Lawrence River, for instance. So we go a little bit, so it's not exactly within the blue line, but as a general tourist
over
region.
Over to Canton, where St. Lawrence had a couple of different sites.
Harrisville on the western side, not to the Tug Hill because that's on a different geography out there. But
that might be a future book.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot more hopefully to come. So yeah.
But many of us of our generation certainly grew up with these smaller ski areas. Some would be family run, some would have a rope tow, a T-bar, and probably the heyday would have been in the 60s and early 70s.
Yes, absolutely. The peak, I call it peak ski area, like peak oil, peak housing, was around 1970. And that's where everything was great. You had the last of the baby boomers were becoming adults at that point, because you had this big surge of school-age children in the 50s and 60s, and the ski areas took advantage of that. Lots of lessons, lots of people learned how to ski, and it really took off. You had so many areas just popping up. family-run areas, big resorts, community ski areas. There was a lot of good snow years in the 60s. It was before the Vietnam War. There was all sorts of things that kind of were very favorable and positive for development. And then it all went south starting in the early 70s after that.
And is that because the cost to operate them was so high, or because we saw places like Whiteface and other bigger resorts open up that offered more trails and snowmaking and were just eye candy and basically people bolted for those?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both. Yeah, so you have the competition, the larger resorts getting bigger and bigger. People tending to flock to them because you'd have more variety. You wouldn't have to wait in line as much. And the cost of operating these small areas was quite expensive. To put in a T-bar or chairlift was many tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars back then, and those dollars. So it'd be very expensive to really improve these areas, add in the snowmaking, add in the fancy grooming that was becoming available. So a lot of these areas hung on as long as they could, and then they ended up closing. But it's also people changed their habits, and they weren't as supportive of some of the smaller mountains, which require a lot of volunteer work. And a decline in volunteer and community groups in the 70s and 80s took place. Nowadays, there's a lot of these areas that have come back or that just barely survived, that now the community is saying, we don't want to lose this, let's get involved. And the community involvement in areas, let's say like Beartown, to keep them sustained has definitely been a savior for a lot of these places.
And that's the type of area where you mentioned the community has rallied around it. It's the place where they grew up skiing and what they want for their kids and grandkids, and so it's survived.
Yep, where it's $25 for a ticket. It's very easy for almost everybody to afford that. And season tickets are $150 or $200 or something like that. It's not $1,000 or anything. So more people can get out and ski. Now you're not going to get the same big mountain ski experience, but you're going to have fun. Kids are going to have fun. Most of the time the kids don't care. They're off jumping. They're off with their friends. They're really wonderful places, these small areas that are still around.
And we've seen a medium size, Big Tupper is an example, where volunteers for the past few years have kept that going. It closed, and then volunteers have reopened it. And now with the big mega resort project there, they're talking about really pumping money into that and turning that into a much bigger and better ski area. Yeah. As you started looking into all the smaller areas, the family-run areas, the community areas, you really found quite a few, as you mentioned, 40 or plus up here in the northern Adirondacks. Lake Placid in particular, I mean, I guess it's not surprising being the winter sports mecca that it is, but I was surprised to find that there were 14, 15 abandoned ski areas in Lake Placid over the years.
Within 2 miles of downtown Lake Placid, about 14 ski areas downtown there. It's amazing. And even right on the main street in Lake Placid, there were several. The Mirror Lake Inn, for instance, had one. They had the first snowmaking in the northern Adirondacks. A little bit ahead of its time, they'd bought a snow machine to make snow in the 50s,
the one
early
at
50s.
Mirror Lake?
Yep, which is now there's one of their buildings is built on the slope, but it was made to be a place where you could go, spend the weekend. If you didn't know how to ski, you'd be able to learn out basically out your guest room door. And the snowmaking helped to ensure that there would be sufficient snowfall. So even back then, it's a little bit of a myth that there was, in the past, always snow all the time with every season. Right. There were a lot of seasons in the 50s that were not that snowy, and having a snow machine, even though it was a very basic model back then, to ensure that the guests would have something to do was a big deal.
And most years, there would always be a January thaw, and that would take away your snowpack. But some of
the
names from Lake Placid from those years: Alpine Lodge, Dream Hill at Mirror Lake is what you had mentioned, Fawn Ridge, Hotel Marcy, that now Northwood's Inn, right on the main drag, had a hill behind it at the time. Yep. Cobble Mountain, Mount Whitney, Old McDonald's Farm, Ski Top, Scott's Cobble,
yep.
Adirondack Lodge had one near its
the practice slope, and it's still the practice slope is still clear there. So that's when it was more privately owned at that time. But they had a rope tow that was out on that slope, and you can still hike up that today.
And Timber Doodle Lodge.
One of those lodges. That was the thing. People could go up there and, you'd spend a weekend. You'd have the ski area at your front door. It was ahead of its time, slope-side lodging in a way. And these were like all-inclusive type places. You'd have your room, you'd have your food, you'd have your meals, your entertainment, and your skiing. And it's amazing. And that Cobble Mountain, too, by the way, that was New York State's first privately owned chairlift. was put in Cobble Mountain. There was a chairlift at Bel Air, and there was a chairlift at Whiteface that was put in a year or so before that. But Cobble stands out as the first privately owned chairlift in New York State in the late 50s, which parts of that actually still operate at West Mountain in Queensbury, New York. It was sold down to there after they closed it. Mainly just the towers and a few components at this point. It's been rehabbed several times, but that's where it ended up going to.
Interesting. Now you mentioned Whiteface. I think a lot of people may be surprised, unless they really grew up in the area and are of an older generation, that before there was Whiteface, New York State operated a ski resort on the other side of Whiteface Mountain, going up the Veterans Highway route to Marble Mountain, and that was back in the 50s, or late 50s into the 60s?
Yep, late 40s into the early 60s.
Really?
1960 was its last season, yes. And that was a major ski area. And in terms of vertical drop, it was 2,500 feet of vertical, which was the greatest vertical that I've been able to find east of the Mississippi River that's ever closed. And it had several rope tows and a T-bar, major T-bar lift. And then at the top of the T-bar, you got off, hopped onto a snowcat that then took you to an upper level with rope tows that are just below the Whiteface Mountain Highway.
So
well
people
up there.
probably wonder why did that close, and why did they go on the other side of the mountain and build Whiteface?
The terrain had potential in terms of the pitch and the vertical, but what it didn't have was the right exposure. And it's before snowmaking, before modern grooming that can kind of fix bad wind issues. But the wind, especially if you look at the valley, it's one big funnel. And with the westerly winds coming up over the side of Mount Esther, Marble Mountain there, coming down into that, it would accelerate and speed up. And it would literally blow a lot of the snow right off the trails. And that was the biggest boondoggle with that, was the weather. And there's actually what they call those flagpole pine trees that show the direction that the wind is blowing. And there's no branches growing on one side, and all the branches are pointing the other side. And that's right near the bottom where the T-bar is. So you can just imagine how windy it all was through there. But for a lost area, it's actually one of the best ones to go and explore, because you can hike up the T-bar lift line. It's a trail that you start at the Atmospheric Research Center. You can park there and go down and hike up the T-bar and see the foundations on the way up, even an old cache for the rescue sleds from the ski patrol is still there. 60 years later, 50 years later, it's still standing. And when you look into the woods, if you're careful and you know where you're looking, especially before the leaves come out, you'll see parallel stone piles that go up the mountain like this, which is the edge of the trails where they had cleared off the rocks and put them on the side.
No kidding.
And now it's all woods. So you can tell where the edges of the trails were by the piles of stones on the side of it.
With so many of these lost ski areas that have faded into the past, you really can't go exploring and because they're on private property, and which you point out in the book. So there are a few, like Marble Mountain, where you can still go and you can see what used to be there. Another one is one that we visited together with you a couple of springs ago. We went up to Dannemora and to Chazy Lake and Lion Mountain. And just off the new trail that heads up to Lion Mountain is all this old equipment. This was part of a ski resort that, I guess back in the 60s, they had high hopes of using Lion Mountain as a major ski resort, and it just never got off the ground. But one T-bar is there. And
fully intact. And that's what's amazing. It's a fully intact ski lift that hasn't operated in over 40 years. And it's all rusted, and it certainly looks pretty beat up, but it's still completely there. And you can go and hike up it and explore it. It's an easy lift line to follow. It's right near the parking lot. As you face the mountain, it's off to the left, and people can go up there and check it out. The ski trails are really overgrown. You can just make them out in a few spots where they used to be. But for the most part, the trails, which were just pretty limited anyway with the T-bar, are overgrown. The old trail to the top of Lion Mountain that went straight up, that was where the lift line was going to go for the next chairlift. And a few of those trails were cut in there, but the lift was never put in.
Just financial reasons?
Financial. Yep, they had high hopes, and if they had gotten it going, it would have been over 2,000 vertical feet. It would have had over a dozen chairlifts. It would have been one of the largest areas in the Northeast. It's a big what if, for the area. Like, what would have happened if that was a huge, massive ski area in terms of economic development? But they just ran out of money. They had some tragedies with some of their managers getting injured or car accidents and stuff, just small things like that that just derailed the project. And it only lasted for a few years and closed in the early 70s and quickly became abandoned. But that's a great one for people to check out, because you can go and explore it without any issues.
And when you went there that day, I kept hearing you reacting to finding what you did there, that much of that lift was still there. Granted, some of those pieces are pretty major and big, but you were somewhat surprised that that much of that was still there.
And how intact it was. And you look up, a couple of the cables have come detached from the towers and are now way up. They're 30, 40 feet in the air, and with the T-bars hanging off of them. And you just wonder who was the last person that rode that lift. And there it is, been hanging up there. No one's touched it in 40 years. It's pretty remarkable.
Many of the other ski areas, though, you really had to do your homework and to go seek them out. Out of all the ones that you found, which was the hardest as far as tracking it down and finding evidence?
Yeah, in terms of exploring it, it's a tough question to answer. Like, which one would be the hardest one to really kind of find out? Whether it's in terms of finding the physically finding it or researching it. But some of these areas, like there was Santa's Workshop, which was the rope tow up near Whiteface. That one was very tough. We only found one reference in one guidebook that it existed.
So you never found any physical evidence?
No physical evidence. No one remembers it, but it's a very specific mention that the tickets were 49 cents for kids, and it was put in a New York State official publication, so there had to be some vetting going on back then. But that was one that was really the toughest one, and so in the book we say it most likely existed, but there's always a chance that it was just planned and never opened. Thankfully, with a lot of historical societies, let's say like the Lake Placid Historical Society, for instance, that have kept archives, it really helps to kind of help illustrate it. So a lot of that, newspaper articles, talking to people, you can help put together these stories. And sometimes you'll have more information. Sometimes you almost have too much information. There's so many articles about them. And other times it can be really hard to find them.
I imagine when you write a book like this and you have your website, you now hear from a lot of people that say, oh, there was another one here and another one there. And so as you accumulate more, there might be potentially a future book down the line.
Yeah, or another edition, and put on the website as well, because no matter how much I researched for this book to try to find every area that you possibly could, there's bound to be one or two that were around for 1 or 2 years behind someone's home, those kind of, really under the radar places. And so, but if anybody has them, they can certainly visit my website and let me know.
And actually, you are planning to write another book. You're going to look over in the Berkshires, over in eastern Massachusetts, western Massachusetts, and some of the ski areas around there. So
that's most likely will be the next one. Yep. Well, there's a lot in that area as well. So, we've had the northern Adirondacks, southern Adirondacks, and parts of Vermont and New Hampshire. So there's plenty of material to go around. There could be another 5 or 10 books for different regions as well, too, for other parts of New York State, Catskills, Hudson Valley, Western New York. As well.
Yeah, New York has hundreds of through the years ski areas, I guess, combined statewide.
And it's got the most number of open ski areas in the country. And most people don't realize that, but New York has about 55, 58 ski areas. They're still open. Everything from a smaller bear town to Whiteface to Hunter Mountain in the Catskills, for instance. So there's the most open number of areas and the most number of closed areas, which I'm estimating about 300 for the state. Because you look at the size of New York, all the different geographical regions, the southern tier, the Hudson Valley, people put up rope tows everywhere. And if we found 85 in the Adirondacks, with a relatively lower population base in some of these other areas, you can only imagine how many more for the rest of the state.
Wonderful book, Lost Ski Areas of the Northern Adirondacks, available at bookstores all over New York, online.
Yes.
Jeremy Davis, thanks a lot for taking the time.
Thanks, Tom. Appreciate it. Thank you.